Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I hope you've all had a lovely cup of tea during the break. Thank you to the last session and to the speakers from the last session. It was nice to see all of your faces. I think one of the things that comes to mind when I see everybody is how much I miss seeing all of these people and how virtual conferences are very much overrated. I'd rather see people in person, right? And I'm sure we'd all agree with that. But before we go to our next keynote by Professor Carolyn Funck from Hiroshima University, just a reminder, a conference isn't a conference without a group photo. So at the end of the keynote discussion period, please don't run away. We'd love to have you in our group photo. And I'm sure the people working behind the scenes here would love you to be there too. So I see Professor Funck in my vision now. Welcome, Funck Sensei. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Can you see me? Yeah, I think.
Yes, we can. I can see you, and I can see your slides, and I can hear you very clearly. Just a very brief introduction to Funck Sensei for those in the audience. Professor Carolyn Funck is a professor for human geography at Hiroshima University, Japan. She is one of the first international scholars to research on tourism in Japan from a geographical viewpoint, and is certainly one of the leading tourism geographers in Japan. Research themes include the development of tourism in Japan, sustainable island tourism, and the contribution of tourism to rural development with a regional focus on the Seto Inland Sea region. And when I first met Carolyn, she kindly invited me to speak. She also introduced me to two of our speakers who were in previous sessions today, Dr. Mong Chu from Hiroshima University and Dr. Ria Usui from Hijiyama University. So there is evidence that the connections we make as researchers run very deep. Recent research topics of Carolyn's include cruise tourism in Japan and Germany and resilience in island tourism, which is the focus of her talk today. Carolyn's research has been conducted in close cooperation with local and regional authorities in Japan, and she has worked in advisory functions on many committees connected to tourism development and regional planning. So welcome, Funck Sensei. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and good evening, everybody. Well, I suppose for some of you, it's still during the morning and you just had your breakfast. So you're maybe more in working mood than I am because I'm already in the after dinner break. So I want to talk today about island tourism in Japan, because this is a topic we have been working on or tried to work on in the last years. So especially as Joseph just mentioned, Menku and Ria Usui are cooperating with me on these research projects, which unfortunately have been, of course, heavily influenced by COVID because we could not do much of the fieldwork that we were planning to. So as I understand, the keynote is more an invitation to think together about a topic rather than presenting some new research results. I would like to ask you today to think together with me about the possibilities of island tourism. And you may find the topic that I chose strange if you have, or if you're not familiar with the situation in Japan. Of course, Japan is an island country, so we would all expect that island tourism is very common here. But my first experience when I came to Japan was that islands don't feature in tourism in the way they do in Europe. And as you know, in Europe, islands are the iconic place of tourism development. But then the situation has gradually changed. And of course, because Japan has so many different islands, we can also see a variety of tourism on islands. So that's how I came up with the title today: Can the diversity of islands create diversity in tourism? So I will start from a few very basic ideas or thoughts. The first one is actually, why do we do research on islands? Isn't an island just one type of a regional division? It could be a valley, or it could be a mountain, or it could be an island. Or the other problem is, if we talk about islands, where do we stop? Japan as a whole is only islands. Australia is an island. So do we talk about island tourism when we talk about Australia? No. So there must be some elements that make islands unique. And on the left side, you will find a list of those. So first of all, islands usually have some characteristic ecosystem, which often connect to a traditional way of life, and also a variety of cultures and languages that are different from whatever mainland they belong to or from each other. Islands are separate from other regional units because they are difficult to access, not only because it's time consuming, but it also costs more money to cross water than to drive on a road. Very often they have restricted resources, especially concerning water or energy. But they have, on the other hand, very often a distinctive image. They are a place apart, and that makes them attractive. That is the reason why islands are the most iconic destinations in tourism. They also, of course, have usually a marine, or if they are, how do you call that? Not seawater, but what's the opposite of seawater? Sorry, my English is gone. If they are non-salt water environments, but still they have a water environment or marine environment, and they are very often in peripheral locations. So usually, while not all islands have all of these features, a combination of these factors is unique to islands. And that's why we study islands as a special type of tourism location or tourism destination. And I don't have to introduce the connection between islands and tourism in detail. I think as tourism researchers, you would all be familiar with the merits, which includes employment, but also on islands, which is very important. They might help to stabilize population, which might otherwise leave the island for better job opportunities or education chances. It can help to preserve nature and culture, increase the leisure opportunities for the local people also, and of course, bring new ideas to the island and create innovation. We are also all familiar with the issues. They come partly because of the seasonal concentration of tourism on islands, which then leads to unstable employment. And of course, tourism can leave a significant environmental footprint. Accessibility impacted by the costs, but also by things like weather and so on is an issue. Tourism might bring changes to local society and culture. And the most important factor probably is that tourism could contribute to further external dependency of islands. So because many of the developers of tourism infrastructure or of tourism facilities would come from outside islands, that means the island economy becomes more and more dependent on outside investment, outside actors. So when we talk about sustainable tourism, we talk about tourism that would increase the merits and address the issues of island tourism. Among these challenges, some are special, some are common to all tourist destinations, but some are especially challenging for islands. And I just picked 3 of them that would be causing especially challenges for islands. One of them is, of course, climate change. Because of the marine environment and being surrounded by sea level rise is going to increase the damage on the coastal structures that are important in tourism. And since most of the tourism development on islands is located along the coast, it will be directly affected by the sea level rise. The change in the marine environment also influences marine resources like fishery and marine leisure possibilities. I put the picture of a jellyfish in the Seto Inland Sea because that is my experience, personal experience of climate change, that the warming of the waters in the Seto Inland Sea has led to an increase in jellyfish, which makes it much less pleasant to swim there than it used to be. The Seto Inland Sea, by the way, is in Japan, located in Japan, between the main island of Honshu and Shikoku. And of course, the increase in extreme weather events will influence the possibility to access islands. So it will be more difficult for the tourists to get there. For islands also, over-tourism is a special challenge because of the limited space and the limited resources, but also because of the seasonal concentration of tourists. So we don't have the tourists spread around the year, but we usually have them concentrated in a certain time period, which means we need extra water resources, extra energy resources to make up for the peak in tourist numbers. Well, what about the COVID-19 pandemic? It is a challenge in that many islands are depending on tourism. So they need the visitors to keep their economy going. On the other hand, many islands, especially smaller islands around the world, have limited access to medical resources. And that means that they are especially vulnerable to a pandemic. In Japan, on top of that, we have the problem that most islands have an aging population, with 50% of the population being above 65 is quite a normal feature on many of the remote islands of Japan. So these were especially vulnerable to becoming infected with COVID-19, especially in the beginning year. So many of the islands would choose to close down and ask people not to come, although that would have a strong influence on their economy. On the other hand, islands have special chances in tourism. The first one, of course, being the uniqueness, which means they are easy to advertise, easy to create an image, easy to say this is the island of something, something. So they can appeal more easily than other destinations. Usually, islands also have a long experience in what we call resourcefulness. So they are used to the effective use of limited natural resources. They create products from traditional industries that are then used for tourism. And on most islands, you will find multiple jobs and activities, sorry, there's a spell miss, combined throughout the seasons. So while people do rely on tourism, it's very common that they do agriculture and tourism, fishery and tourism, or some other work combined with tourism. And COVID has brought not only challenges, but it has also brought chances. One of them being that outdoor activities increase in popularity. So like on the picture, you will see a camping facility on some of the islands close by. These kind of place activities where you can be outside and apart from other visitors become very popular during the pandemic. So this might bring new customers to islands. Also, on many islands, not on all of them, it is possible to control the number of visitors through the access by boat or plane, which means it is in principle possible to control density, which then might mean that an island could choose to say, okay, we will be a low density destination. And the remote spaces on the islands can be or will be mostly perceived as safe. So we can see that COVID has brought challenges for islands as well as new chances. So far, I have been talking about islands, but of course, we have to ask the question if all islands are similar. And I think there are very common images of islands as we see on these pictures of slow life. They are exotic and they help us to escape from routine. The tourism on islands is focused on sun, water, and beach. So in the tourist's imagination, probably, first of all, at the first view or impression, all islands might seem similar. But of course, they are not. I have used a distinction made by Gracie and Maher and added some middle part to it. So we can divide islands based on a variety of factors. First of all, it's the climate, which then connects to the resources or to the tourism products. So we have warm water islands with warm air and water, but also cold water island with unpredictable weather and rain. Depending on that, the season might be short or long, or if we are on the in-between islands, we might have multiple seasons. The tourism resource could be sun, sand, and sea, or it could be cliffs and wild nature, or in the in-between islands that are very often located closer to cities. It could be a mixture of rural and historical landscapes. Vegetation will also be different, and tourist activities would be more on the relaxed party fun side on the warm water islands compared to what could be called serious leisure on cold water island or cultural tourism in between. We also have differences depending on the degree of independence. A lot of research concentrates on, a lot of island research actually concentrates on the sovereign island states or independent territories, because it's actually quite, or it's easier to research these political unities. But many islands are really dependent on some kind of mainland. They have different degrees of accessibility. I will introduce one island later that has only 10 minutes distance to the next coast. Others would have 2 days by boat. Different from popularity and to the degree of economic development. So the chances and challenges need to be analyzed for each island. Whereas the common perception of islands by the tourists would normally be concentrated on the warm water islands. So far, this is a kind of general introduction to islands. So when we think about islands, we should not go with the general tourism image of warm water islands, but we should try to analyze chances and challenges for development or for tourism or sustainable tourism on each island, but still keep in mind a kind of order, like this would be one suggestion of how to group islands. So now I would like to take you to Japan. The number of inhabited islands in Japan is actually changing because more and more are becoming uninhabited because the last residents moved to more comfortable places. In 2015, it counted 418 and 260 of them were designated as remote islands, which means they will receive special assistance for building infrastructure and so on. Their population is only 0.3% of the national population. And the rate of population over 65 10 years ago was 35%. By now, it's obviously much higher. And in the figure, you can see that while the population of Japan as a whole had been increasing from 1955 to 2010, after that, it's actually declining right now, the population of the remote islands has been more than halved. So Japan has these many islands, but because of the location of Japan and the fact that it is a very long stretched country, it includes all types of islands, going from warm water islands to in-between islands, up to the cold water islands in the north. So with this variety of islands in Japan, we can assume that the research on islands has been very advanced. There has actually been a lot of research on islands, but most of it are ethnographic studies on individual islands. And they tend to emphasize the uniqueness, which is born out of the combination of natural features, like also climate, and the cultural elements that developed on the islands. So there are very few theoretical or national studies. There are few quantitative studies that try to cluster islands into certain groups. But in general, we can see that the individual island and its uniqueness is what fascinates the researchers. And that's what I'm going to be talking about actually too. We had several waves of island research parallel to social development, like a resort boom in the 1980s or the return of Okinawa to Japan in the 1970s and so on. And especially after Okinawa was returned to Japan, the focus of all island research has been heavily on the southern islands. Within the policies, islands are very often seen as disadvantaged. So I already mentioned the Remote Island Promotion Law. So there is this narrative that islands have a disadvantage, so they need to be helped. So the major research themes have been agriculture, settlements, and so on, whereas tourism came up only in the 1980s and 2000s. And there is also an attempt to start an independent study of islands called Nisology. Well, one thing that makes islands in Japan different from the ones in Europe is that the water-based tourist activities, meaning beach, surfing, diving, boating, and so on, are actually not as popular in Japan as you would assume. For domestic tourism, if we look at the participation rates, beach tourism as well as fishing have been declining, whereas diving, surfing, and boat sailing have been very low anyway. For the international tourists, in the visitor survey for international tourists that is conducted every year, there is not even a category for water-based activities, only one for ski and snowboard. So we can see that Japan for international tourists is definitely not a beach destination. But that means, on the other hand, that the island image is not restricted to the 3 S of sea, sand, and sun. That's why we have the possibility of developing diverse forms of island tourism here. So now I would like to introduce some islands to give you an idea of this diversity. Somehow, giving a lecture on island tourism, you always end up talking about lots of islands. It's probably the only way to kind of handle this issue. So first of all, I would like to introduce an island that maybe some of you have already visited or at least seen in a tourist guide, which is the island of Miyajima, which is an iconic island in that way that it features a red shrine gate standing in the water. So it has been said that it's a sacred island. It is also said that the forest or the mountain behind the shrine, as you can see in this picture, is a primeval or natural forest. Both of these things are only partly true because the forest has, of course, been used in the past or it has burned down for wildfires. So it's not really a primeval forest. And the question whether the island is sacred can be debated, as it has been a trade post and also a prostitution quarter in times in history. So, but it is very successful in giving this image of sacred, pristine nature island. In one questionnaire I did about which islands people visited in Japan by Japanese, it was the most visited island. And it has a diversity of cultural and natural attractions, including the shrine, but also climbing up the mountain behind the shrine. It has an aquarium, it has several kinds of, it has a shopping street, and of course, different tourism infrastructure. And as you can see here, the number of visitors has actually been declining at one point, but now or before COVID was over 5 million, partly thanks to the high number of international tourists. The island throughout history has been very successful in attracting or shifting its target groups. Just in the recent 30 years, it has shifted, for example, from school trips to international tourists and now to microtourism. And the high increase in the number of visitors in the last 10 years has led to a diversification of tourism products, of investment and work styles. That being said, most of the tourism facilities in the island are still run by local or at least regional capital. And there has been very little, well, there has been increasing intrusion, so to say, by, for example, national shop chains. But in general, the local or regional component of the tourism industry is still very, very strong. So this island is actually a very good example of how diverse resources and the possibility to adjust to changes. Whenever there is a decrease in tourists, people on the island or in the tourism industry would start to think about what to do. And then they might be helped by bigger events like the increase of international tourists to Japan to go to the next step. So they have probably run through the resort development stages several times in the 100 of years that this island has been attracting visitors. Of course, Japan also has the southern islands. I have not researched in depth about them, so I would only give you just 2 ideas about them. One of them is the island of Yoron, which is the southernmost island of Kyushu, and it has been mainly created as a tourist destination through national media and movies. So it became popular as a hippie or free love island in the 1970s or 60s, but later changed to a more kind of relaxing mood that was coined by a movie where this was called Tasogare, kind of hanging out. On the other hand, the islands of Okinawa have been developed by outside investment, like this hotel. Outside investment could be what the Okinawan people call the Japanese from the mainlands or international tourist industries. In recent years, we have seen some islands establishing themselves as so-called iconic islands. And could we call them iconic? Iconic, very often, we have these kind of rankings of islands, the islands most young girls want to move to, and that would normally be Naoshima #1. So Yakushima and Naoshima, these 2 islands both rank very high on these kind of popularity lists where people want to move to. And I think the reason is they have both developed over 30 years. They have a very distinct image. In the case of Yakushima, it is ecotourism. In the case of Naoshima, it is art and architecture tourism. They have both been independent municipalities throughout the tour process, meaning they have been able to kind of develop their own identity. And in all of them, you see a mix of actors inside the destination and outside. So in Yakushima, it was the combination of becoming a World Heritage, national government creating a system of protection, then eco-tour guides and lifestyle migrants coming into the island, but also local people developing tourism industries as guidance entrepreneurs. It is debatable whether this system is sustainable in the long term because the island has been losing tourists for a while and had some environmental issues to fight. Now, Shima is a very unique combination of the local administration working with the prefecture and a large education company and an art director to develop art, architecture, and art festival. Once again, we have a mix of lifestyle migrants and local entrepreneurs. So these 2 islands are an example of a long-term, independent, and clearly distinguished image that has been developed. Another important issue for island tourism is not individual islands, but group of islands or island chains. Of course, we have several of those in Japan. And the 2 examples I'm introducing here is the Shimanami Islands, which became popular as cycling tourism area, mainly through outside interest after the cycling boom started in Japan in 2005, and an international cycling company became engaged. And the Goto Islands, which are still in the process of developing a distinguished image, since they became World Heritage, and there has been heritage accommodation development. A problem with these two chains is actually that they are either across two prefectures or across two municipalities. And it is sometimes very difficult for them to create a cohesive image because each island is actually more reliant on the mainland rather than the neighboring island. So to create a connection between the islands of an island chain is actually quite a difficult, has actually been quite a difficult task. Finally, there is another aspect of island diversity, and that is the target group. What kind of tourists do you want to attract? So it's not only the topic, art or ecotourism, but we should also think about what kind of people want to come to the island, should come to the island. And there we have seen a trend to luxury tourism development. I have been looking for data to back up the increasing social divide in Japanese society, but I have not been able to find decisive material to show you. So this is still work in progress. It is said very often in media and research that we do see an increase in the social divide in Japan. So there is a bigger group of people who have a high income, and they usually live in the capital area of Tokyo, and we have lower incomes in other areas. So there is an increased market for luxury accommodation, also by the international tourists. On the other hand, there was very few luxury accommodation available outside of the big cities. So we have seen the development of these kind of facilities. On the right hand is a camp on a luxury day camp on an uninhabited island, which is run by a hotel from a local shipbuilding company. And the example I want to explain a little bit more is a luxury hotel in a historic building that was developed in cooperation with the local tourism industry or shopping street, a regional transportation company, and the DMO, and a company that developed the the hotel is a company that is actually connected to an international resort company, although it is financially independent. So if we have this island luxury development on the islands, that might lead to the creation of two distinct tourism spaces. And we have seen this pattern actually on Naoshima, or on the art tourism islands, where we have the new built hotels, which are very luxurious and well managed, and the museums. But because tourists come to the museums, but not all of them can stay in luxury accommodation, that helped to develop a different sector of affordable, close to daily life, kind of disorderly tourism development. But the interesting thing is there is nothing in between. So you can stay in an accommodation for maybe $30 or $300. But nothing, there is not so much choice in between. So we see that if we create these luxury retreats on the one hand, it might lead to a split of the tourism spaces on the island. And in the case I just introduced before, we get two different parts of the island. So part of it looks like this. This is a modern cafe shop that was created together with the hotel. But then we have the derelict, abandoned shops in the old shopping street. And actually, this connects directly to this part of the shopping street. So the question is here, do we have three choices only? Will this side win? Or will this side be preserved as a kind of retro charm for the tourists who stay here? Or will this part be finally transformed completely into this part? So in this case, in the town of Setodar, which I introduced with this hotel, we have a very interesting combination where the investor in the hotels tried to develop the whole town or connect to the town And there is a really large group of actors now involved in the attempt, what is called in Japanese machizukuri, or neighborhood creation. So there is a spin-off from the resort company, which is a kind of company that runs this local cafe and tries to attract other tourism investment. There are several companies who came in to work through the workshop. There are students from universities or local high schools, the Shopping Street Association, the Regional Transportation Company, city administration, and they created a workshop for 3 years where they tried to discuss future images of the town, but also make actual improvements like choosing yellow because the town is famous for lemon production as the color, and then using it to kind of change the actual image of the island. So this is a progress still in the making, and I'm not quite sure how it will turn out in the end. But it shows that the cooperation of different actors from outside and inside might really lead to innovation. But it is not sure if that will kind of transform the whole island or just part of it. So we will see how this process will go on. And finally, I mentioned with COVID that we have more people visiting islands. So they're trying to escape to nature by visiting islands, which is actually a type of tourism that has not been so common in Japan so far. That is different from Europe. So these are two examples where also, once again, lifestyle migrants or people from outside were using resources on the island that were originally developed for tourism but not used. So on the left side is a former second house, which was then abandoned. So it was reformed, and you can see they are building a bath on the veranda. So hot bath is very important in Japanese tourism. So you can have your own bath while watching the sunset. And this is a migrant to a nearby city who then bought this house, renovated it with local workforce, and it is now run as an accommodation facility by local people who also provide catering services. And on the right side, it's not only the people who moved, but also the dolphins. So this is a camp area here, a former camp area which wasn't used anymore, and was then developed in combination with the dolphin beach together. So on these two islands, we have a combination of idling tourism resources, people migrating from the outside. From the outside still means mostly within Japan. So we have a few international migrants on these islands, but most of them are Japanese. And outdoor, and the possibility to have distance to other tourists because you have your own house or tent. And there have also been a lot of subsidies from local governments to promote this kind of tourism during the COVID pandemic. So I have introduced several islands, and as usual, it's very hard to combine that talk into one cohesive conclusion. But I think what we can say is, once again, based on Gracie and Maher's book, we could say there are 4 things that are important for tourism islands to survive in the global competition. That would be to develop a holistic and comprehensive approach to tourism, which means you would have also to create diversity within the island, like we have seen on Miyajima, for example. There is a necessity to innovate and reinvent when necessary, for example, during the pandemic, and to use technology and innovation for this management of tourism and of development, and active resourcefulness for indigenous development. That will then help to create diversity between islands. And diversity from outside the island will actually is actually important to promote these 3 elements, because without the input from the outside, it will not be possible to make changes. And the combination of these factors will then possibly make the island unique to stand out. However, there is, of course, one difficult issue to solve, which is if you create diversity within the island and diversity, then how do you promote the island as one island as the island. So we have the usual balance between diversity and unity. So I think the Japanese islands give a very good idea about how many, or what kind of endless possibilities islands have, and that they should not be restricted to just sun, sea, and sand, as they have been in the imagination of the European or Western tourists for a long time. Thank you for your attention. And this is the references and literatures I used.
Thank you very much, Funck Sensei, for that very thoughtful presentation. There are many layers and many directions in which the provocations you've made can go. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to raise them. I see that there are a number of people in the audience who are island tourism scholars. So I see Marcia Blasquez from the University of Balearic Islands, and Solène Prince, who's written a lot about tourism on islands. So please feel free to raise a question. If perhaps it's too much to type it out in the Q&A box, perhaps raise your hand and maybe our technical team can give you the mic. But for now, Funck Sensei, you've raised lots of questions, and clearly you've spent a lot of time thinking about islands and being on islands. From the time spent in Japan, I've noticed some of the literature, especially written by people from outside of islands, criticizing the way the Japanese government has tried to build resilience on islands through what's called engineering resilience, you know, building concrete seawalls and barriers and the use of tetrapods. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because as someone not living on an island, we would look at it and say, oh, doesn't that ruin the view for tourism or for anything for that matter? But for people who live on islands, it's about protecting lives and livelihoods. And I was wondering whether you had some comment on how we can negotiate those differing perspectives on what building resilience on islands means.
Well, of course, that is a common question. Like whenever I take people to islands in the Seto Inland Sea, it's kind of very often people are disappointed because most of these islands are heavily developed, meaning they have a road going all around the island, and there is more concrete coast than beach coast, obviously. And I've spent a lot of time in Japan searching for swimmable beaches rather than because they were all filled up with concrete. But yeah, but I'm also, having lived in Japan, I know a lot about the vulnerability to natural disasters. So I do see a need for protection against those, but the way it is done is very heavily disputed. So also what we have seen in rebuilding the wall, a kind of seawall all along the coast of the East Japan area where the earthquake happened, that has been heavily debated by the people, by scientists, as not being useful for the building industry, but not really being useful as protection. And a very good example is actually Miyajima, because in Miyajima, the shrine is built in a way that the construction of the shrine protects the main shrine building from the sea and from the waves. And it is built in a way that it is moved out of the main wind direction, and that the kind of platforms in front of the shrine would dampen the waves that reach the shrine. But it looks very nice. It looks very beautiful. It's made of wood. So we know there are other ways of doing this protection. It's just that, well, the industry has so far chosen the more comfortable way of using lots of concrete, which brings a lot of money, obviously. So I think in engineering too, we see a shift in Japan. There are now, of course, architects and engineers that promote a more kind of careful way of creating resilience against natural disasters. So it is technically possible.
Thank you, Karen. It raises the very issue we talked about earlier in Devi Sensei's presentation about natural disasters, or are they natural hazards? Because natural disasters are argued by many scientists to have a social and political element rather than be purely about the disaster itself. But thank you for that. A question from Susanna Klein in Hokkaido. And it touches on a topic that I've written down here in terms of the way islands develop either bottom up or top down. And Susanna Sensei says that, do you see a future of more hotels on remote islands that link luxury and architecture or art? And she's thinking of the newly opened Ento on Oki Island.
Oh, this is definitely a trend. So first of all, we have a trend right now to luxury hotels making use of historic buildings or modern, either historic buildings or modern architecture or combination of both. So there is even now a chain of these historic Machiya house hotels. So that is definitely a trend. And these hotels, of course, profit from a setting on an island because that will increase their exclusivity. But as I mentioned, does that mean that the whole island space has to be adjusted to entertain these tourists? Or will they just stay within the enclave of the luxury retreat? And that is really the big question. Because if they venture out to the island, they will require different types of food, they will require different types of activities. And of course, we know that might lead to tourist gentrification, which we have seen on Naoshima Island already. So it is definitely a trend, but there's the question of how big the market is, how many luxury hotels do we need on these islands? And then there is the question of how do you integrate that in the local society?
Right. Yeah, and it touches on what Dominic said earlier about how places at the periphery, especially rural places and now islands, are conceived very differently in the pandemic, you know, as places for security and sanitation, whereas before the pandemic, they were seen as out of the way, more or less. Nancy G, who you might know, and I think Nancy must be in Melbourne, Australia, she says, thank you for the presentation. Do you have any thoughts on how to measure the effectiveness of the different strategies that are adopted to revitalize islands, for example, through migration or otherwise? Nancy says that the workshop you showed tries to engage local actors. How do we evaluate such activities and their contribution, revitalization?
Well, that's a very good question. That's what we are trying to find out in our research project, actually. So, for example, if you look at the Naoshima and the art islands, it is very hard to say they are not successful. But still a lot of people say they don't like it so much. But why? You cannot really define it. So, and of course, I think the measure for success is different for everybody. So for the local people, I think one measure of success would be to stabilize population. That is for all Japanese islands, I think, a very important point, more so than economic effects being that it really leads to people living on the island. But yeah, other things are really hard to say. I suppose one point would be how much it involves people in a positive way. So how do we measure that? I mean, how many people would say, yes, it has changed my life for the better? But yeah, we don't want to ask everybody on the island all the time.
Yeah, but indeed,
it would be such a nuisance for them.
Yes, in terms of measuring change, for us as researchers, our timelines in trying to understand change are often much shorter, right? The people who live on an island, measuring change happens over a decade or more. But as researchers, we don't necessarily have the patience or the resources or the time to be able to see that period out. Which brings us to another, sorry.
Yeah, that is something I'm very grateful that I have been able to observe the changes on many of these islands for over 20 years now. And I think that's at least a kind of reasonable time scale.
Yes, indeed. Marcia Blasquez Salon from the University of Balearics. Good morning, Marcia. He says, thank you for your speech, Carolyn. He says, as you said, the islands with over-tourism, such as Mallorca, are very different from the ones you've worked on in Japan. But he says in his mind, island gentrification tends to be a shared process, which also happens on mass tourism islands. I wonder if you have a comment about gentrification and this idea of it being a shared process rather than something that happens to people.
What do you mean by shared process? Shared between whom?
Well, Marcy has followed up with a comment. local governance is then an issue and academic involvement is much needed. So when I think he said shares between the islanders as well as the outsiders, the bureaucrats, and whoever else has an interest in the island.
Yeah, so I think that is true. And we are currently discussing if gentrification, well, gentrification normally is seen as bad because it replaces one population with another. But in the case of the Japanese islands, if you have a disappearing population, then how do you define, is gentrification really bad? Because if there is no population left to be replaced, would it be better to have a population, even if it's not the original one? So that is the really tricky question. How do you draw the borderline between tourism gentrification and tourism development? I suppose tourism gentrification would be the point where local people have to leave the island because they cannot afford to buy land or to rent a house or to buy the food. But except for Naoshima, I think we have very few islands that have reached that stage.
Yes.
So in most islands, people are actually kind of glad if people move in because it will stabilize the population. So
yes, I think Funck Sensei, that's probably a very distinct thing with Japanese islands where they're characterized by declining populations. Many of the islands that Marcia works on in the Balearics, Ibiza, Mallorca, populations are actually increasing, right? Second homeowners, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's a really interesting contrast, and it would be interesting to see more of that kind of comparison between Japan and, say, Spain as an example. Invitation to you, Marcia, to come to Japan and do some research.
Well, he was taking part in our symposium last year, right? 2 years ago, sorry.
Yes, yes. And he's a visiting fellow here at Wakayama University, but hasn't been able to visit. So that brings us to another question. It looks like this question comes from Bali. Sorry, it says anonymous attendee, so I can't refer to you personally. I see it says, Professor Funck, what would be feasible solutions to diverse an island's economy that's already been built through tourism and already become heavily reliant on tourism, like Bali?
Well, I do think, I have not been to Bali, but from what I know, I think it is already diverse in that sense that it has natural as well as cultural elements, right? So it has the beach section, but it also has a very strong cultural section of the unique Bali culture. And that would be the first step, I think, to bridge the divide between natural resources and cultural resources and combine them, because the cultural resources are less dependent on the weather or on the climate. Well, that's maybe not the problem in Bali, but so they would help to balance the seasonality. So for example, in the case of Yakushima, it is very heavily dependent on ecotourism, nature tourism, but it rains a lot. It rains almost every day. So they are trying to develop a kind of cultural ecotour where people also learn about the local culture, and these tours would be less dependent on the weather. So I think the first step really would be to integrate cultural and natural elements.
There's no question it's a very difficult shift to make from one of over-dependence to trying to reduce your dependence on that. As you say, there needs to be other avenues to diversify the economy. And we see this in Bali already, where there's been a shift towards seaweed farming once again, which was once a staple livelihood, but drifted away because of tourism and now drifting back. So perhaps this is this kind of natural cycle of boom and bust. And
yeah. So the important thing is to keep something during the boom period. Then it doesn't, you can have it back again during the bust. But I think then an important point in Japan also is that the interest in local food is very strong among domestic tourists, and that helps to preserve the kind of agriculture or fishery that you have on the different islands. So people really want to eat the local food. And that helps to keep these industries, primary industries and food processing industries alive, which make a good balance to the tourism.
Yeah, and it highlights the local. Yes. And Nicholas Sensei has a question in regards to, I think it's around cooperation amongst islands. He says, I was wondering if there's any kind of initiative that may group islands together so that they can pool their resources together to achieve further development and attract more visitors. And I suppose the opposite of that is islands competing against each other. For the, yeah, go ahead.
There is, well, one thing is the island chains I mentioned. So the for example, the Shimanami Kaido has been trying to promote the islands together as a chain kind of focused on cycling tourism. And Japan has recently trying to develop DMOs on several levels. So not only local, but regional level. And there is one DMO for the Seto Inland Sea area, which really actively tries to promote islands as part of the tourism product, especially through small scale cruising, but also including art as another element. So yes, there is this, at least in Japan, we can see the tendencies that there are a kind of umbrella brand. So they create the umbrella brand of Seto Uchi, but within that, each single island will be having their own brand. I think that's a common system in tourism and also in other industries. I mean, you have a car brand, but then you have the whole car company, but then you have the single car models, which are independent brand again. So the concept of umbrella brand with then individual brands below that, I think works very well for groups of island or island chains.
Thank you for that. One last question here before we finish up. Does the historical use of islands influence the way islands are perceived and used in the present? And I guess this question came up when Ria Sensei was talking about rabbits on Rabbit Island, right? But of course, what we know from islands, not just in Japan, but elsewhere, is that in the distant past, islands were often used as places where you did things that you didn't want to do on the mainland. You know, for example, where you dumped things, or where you built a factory or an ammunition site, like we see here in Japan, right? And even in countries like Australia, where people who suffer from leprosy were put on an island. Indeed, Australia as an island is where the British send all their convicts because they didn't want them in Britain, right? So islands as a historical kind of device have these dark histories. But then in the present, we try to create the sun, sand, and sea vibe around them and the cute rabbits on Rabbit Island. So I wonder, how do the histories, the historical landscape of islands influence the way they are used in the present?
Well, that's a difficult question because it depends on how the people who want to develop tourism or who are engaged in tourism, how they want to deal with that. In theory, it would always be better to integrate that element in the tourism development because it will add another factor of uniqueness. And also we have nowadays a very strong trend in tourism that attracts people to darker places. So like in Japan, also some of these islands like the Gunkanjima, which used to be the old coal mine or so, are attractive because they are dark. But on the other hand, the Japanese government, for example, is trying to promote Sado Island and the gold mines as World Heritage, but trying not to mention the dark elements in it. So personally, I think it's a shame. It's much better to integrate it because it gives it an additional uniqueness and attraction. But it's of course difficult to balance. Like when we took international students to Rabbit Islands, we had some Chinese students and they said they couldn't visit the museum. It was too hard for them. And it kind of heavily influenced their experience of the island. So the balance, once again, is hard to strike, but integrating such elements is definitely better than ignoring them.
Okay, and Damon Drummond just mentioned, he said, and what about pirates on islands? So I guess, I guess, yes, indeed. There are modern day pirates on islands now, Damon. As one of the case studies that you work on in Naoshima with Mo Sensei, you know, this idea that art and architecture, but then we also know that on part of the island is a very large factory, which is on the other side, right? So islands have this multi-layered kind of backdrop, whereas tourism selects the best bits and then forgets about the rest. So with that said, Funck Sensei, do you have any final comments before we before we thank you for your excellent keynote this evening?
Well, I just would say, I hope you will all get a chance to come to Japan soon and visit the islands themselves, because, yeah, I think it's really a good inspiration for discovering the many different possibilities that islands have from this variety of types of development, types of resources, types of islands that we have available here. So I would say it's a very good inspiration. So I hope to see you here soon.
Thank you very much, Funck Sensei. If we were doing this in person, someone would have brought a bunch of flowers to you on stage. So we will just have to imagine that in our head and say thank you once again for your generosity and taking the time to share your insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. I'm sorry I couldn't take part in many of the sessions because of meetings, but
no, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure. Stromer also made one last comment: islands as migrant jails. So we can see that islands have this kind of very multi-layered history, and in the present, it makes for good storytelling, as you say, Funck Sensei. So before we finish up, the final thing we need to do today, thank you once again, Funck Sensei. The final thing we need to do today is say our usual.